for it like some of our other diseases, right? We can't see it early in the season and make a decision on a fungicide application. We really need to make a decision on a management strategy before we actually see symptoms. Now, another kind of key diagnostic feature is you can actually see some of the fungal structures sometimes. We call these sporodokia, these orange-pink structures on the outside of the spikelet. That happens when there's high humidity, and that's pretty diagnostic for this disease. You know, there's a good example there of when it's severe, right? You can see large portions of the head can become bleached. And then you can also see what the grain looks like at harvest, right? So sometimes this disease happens so late in the season. Really, our first indication that we have an issue is after harvest, or even when we pull up to the co-op there. So kind of key grain issues that we see are lightweight, chalky, kind of discolored kernels. Sometimes those kernels can actually appear pink, right? So we can get discounts for scabby kernels, right? Just if they have that visual scabby look, that'll appear on discount schedules. And then sometimes we can get dockages for the toxin this disease produces, which is called vomit toxin or DON. You might see that. Those are more rare, but they do pop up in years when we have pretty severe scab. Right, so those are some of our basics just about scab management. So the key that I mentioned is that infection actually happens at flowering, right? So this is at highest risk when we're going back into corn residue, right? This disease also survives in corn residue, produces a sister disease called Gibberella ear rot and corn stalk rots, right? Same pathogen causes those diseases in both corn and wheat. And the key is we really get infection at that flowering time, right? But again, we don't see symptoms until well into grain fill. So flowering is when we need to make a fungicide decision, which can be tricky, right? Because we have to decide if we have high risk, right? If we're going back into corn, if we have a susceptible variety, and if the weather's been favorable for disease development, right? So favorable weather, that includes conditions where our relative humidity is high, right? So I get a lot of phone calls when it's kind of misty rain and warm temperatures right around flowering, right? That's kind of if you get out and there's dew on the plants around flowering, that's kind of an indicator that we're at high risk for scab, right? We've got that good moisture at that flowering window. We also have a forecasting tool, right? That'll give us some indication of our risk of this disease. That's at wheatscab.psu.edu. We'll put that out in e-updates, and we'll try to make reminders about that weather condition. But that'll give you some idea on if you have favorable conditions at that flowering time to pull a trigger on a fungicide application. So this study here, this is a kind of a longer term study where we're looking at integrated management of Fusarium head blight. So we're looking at the effect of variety and fungicide combined here. So we've changed the varieties over the years to represent more agronomically relevant varieties, right? We've kind of tossed out the varieties that have kind of gone out of favor, and we've added new varieties in over the years. But the three varieties we have here are Green Hammer, that's an Oklahoma variety. The thing we like about Green Hammer, you might not like, is that it's pretty susceptible to Fusarium head blight, right? So that's our susceptible variety. That's kind of representing what we'd have in a lot of our varieties that don't have good scab resistance. Then we have a variety Bob Dole in the back. You're probably familiar with Bob Dole, very popular in this part of the state for a long time. That represents a more intermediate reaction, kind of a middle of the pack to susceptible reaction. And then 4401 here represents kind of a more moderately resistant or intermediate variety. Now, a very key thing about these three varieties is that even though we've got a range here, we've got very susceptible, we've got a little less susceptible, and kind of an intermediate variety, none of these are perfect, right? And that kind of represents what we've got going on in the state. If we have very high pressure, A variety like 4401 that does have intermediate resistance will become symptomatic, right? So the variety alone really isn't a silver bullet if we have high disease pressure, right? And that's kind of what we've shown here. So we also, we want to pair that with a fungicide application, right? So what we have here are 6 different fungicide applications. So we have a product called Fusarium Pro, that's PP right there. That's a newer Bayer product. It's a kind of a replacement product for the product Fusarium. It adds a group 7 fungicide into the mix with the active ingredients that were in the product Fusarium. They kind of reformulated those ingredients as well. We also have a product called Miravis Ace, right? That's a Syngenta product. It's a newer product, but it's shown a great efficacy for scab control. This is our control, right? So this is untreated, so no fungicide, right? So it's always good to have a control in these types of experiments. This is Fusarium, right? So we have Fusarium Pro over there. This is just Fusarium at its recommended label rate here. This is a non-inoculated control. I'll get back to that in a second. And that's a BASF product, Spherex. That SX is a newer BASF product called Spherex, right? So these kind of represent the most common and available products for scab control, right? Now that I'll come back to that non-inoculated control. So you can see we're not actually on corn. Well, we've got a little bit of corn residue here. But the way we get disease here is we actually inoculate. So we'll come in at that flowering time and we'll inoculate a couple of times with an actual pass of spores. So we're bypassing some of the biology of the spores coming up from the residue there, and we'll come through and inoculate at that flowering time point to try to make sure we have a chance of infection. Now the other key piece of that is we need the right weather, right? And Scott can't control that. I keep asking him, Scott, can you make it nice and humid and warm here on the station, right, at flowering? And it seems like, he hasn't been able to do that yet, right? So we don't always get the right weather. So even if we have the pathogen, and that's a great example here today, we don't always get symptoms, right? And that's really that weather piece of the puzzle. So this non-inoculated control is the control where we didn't inoculate and we also didn't apply a fungicide. So we can get a gauge of how much kind of natural pressure there is in the field. So some of the interesting results that we've had, we just published a paper on the last 5 years of data from this location here. The interesting thing is that variety plus fungicide matters a lot, right? So when we have just a variety, we had Zenda in the past, now we have 4401. When we have a variety that has that good genetic resistance, even though it's not perfect, it actually does a lot of heavy lifting. So one of the interesting things in that is when you have a variety like 4401 or Zenda, that actually performs better in most cases than green hammer treated with a fungicide. Right? So the variety is pulling a lot of the weight when it comes to management, but it's not perfect, right? So if we got 80% control with a good resistant variety, we could get up to 98% control when we added the fungicide into the mix there, right? So that's why we're always talking about integrated management for this disease in particular. It really matters marrying a variety that has the best available resistance with that well-timed fungicide. That's when we're getting close to complete control. Maybe not complete control, but close to complete control in that example. And we could never achieve complete control when we have a variety green hammer, even when we use the fungicide that worked the best, which in our case was Miravis Ace. It did work slightly better than Fusarium Pro and Fusarium and some of the other products that we tested in some of our research here. So again, if we had green hammer, which might be an agronomically good variety, right? Plus a Miravis Ace application, it still underperformed a variety in terms of everything, really all the above: disease control, toxin control, and yield when we paired those together, right? So this study's been a nice illustration of that component. I'll just talk quickly. In this study, we don't have it here, but in the last 5 years, we actually also looked at timing of that product, Miravis Ace. One of the big label suggestions for a while there was that it can be applied early. So one of the issues with Scab, right, is we have to get that good timing, which is during the flowering window, ideally early during the flowering window. That's very hard to hit. We struggle to, basically I have a team that's pretty much camping here next to the plots, watching to make sure we hit that early flowering time point, right? So I understand that's really hard to get for the wheat crop, especially in Kansas when we're moving pretty fast later in the season. So we compared that Miravis Ace at heading versus Miravis Ace at early flowering, right? And one of the key things there is we got a slight benefit from going at early flowering, but we still got pretty good control of heading, right? So we do have some flexibility there. As long as we can get that product on at or after heading through that pre-harvest interval there, we can do pretty well with Miravis Ace. So those are the key take-home messages, right? We don't have any perfect varieties, but if we're going into a high-risk scenario, which is our wheat after corn into corn stubble, especially if we're under pivot, right? That would be the highest risk scenario. Marrying these varieties that have better resistance with that appropriate timed fungicide application really is the best strategy that we have and our best recommendation there for Scab.